opens with Paul's lament over the lostness and present-day unbelief of most of first-century ethnic Israel. This was despite, as Paul indicated, the blessings that God had lavished upon them throughout their history as God's chosen people. Now, such a predicament would have presented a dilemma to the Jewish reader of the epistle to the Romans. The inevitable question in their mind arises, how could the majority of God's chosen people be lost? And if they are, then doesn't this indicate a failure on God's part to fulfill His promises to them? Now, such a question would have been posed due to the underlying assumption that the entire physical seed of Abraham, all those who had descended from Abraham, were an heir to the promises, particularly the promises of the everlasting land inheritance contained within the Abrahamic covenant. But that assumption that the entire physical seed of Abraham, all those who had descended from Abraham, were an heir to the promises, that itself was a misunderstanding, a fundamental misunderstanding of the Abrahamic promises. As Paul wrote elsewhere in Galatians chapter 3, he said, that to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He does not say, and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is Christ. So the promises were initially delivered to Abraham and his seed, Jesus Christ, seed which is singular. They weren't meant for simply all those who claimed descendancy from Abraham, or all of ethnic Israel. When we come to Romans 9, verse 6, which reads, "It is not as though the word of God had failed, for not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel," Paul explains that the reason that the word of God had not failed is because from God's perspective, He has made a distinction within Israel. There is a spiritual Israel within the larger body of ethnic Israel. Now, verse 6 alone doesn't tell us how God has made such a distinction, nor does it tell us the basis upon which God has made this distinction. How does one become spiritual Israel? No, it simply tells us that God has made a distinction within Israel, period. Calvinists assume that the way in which God makes this distinction is due to His unconditional election of some Israelites, which would be spiritual Israel, to salvation, while the rest of Israel is simply passed over. They assume, without warrant here in my opinion, that the way in which God fulfills, or will fulfill, His promises to spiritual Israel is through election, specifically unconditional election. Many of them jump to verse 11, which to them reads like unconditional election to salvation, which says, "For the twins not yet being born, nor having done any good or evil, the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of Him who calls." They read that verse, verse 11, back into verse 6. Check out this clip from Mike.
If you look in verse 6, it says, the last part, "For not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel." Now, what does he mean by that, and how is that the answer to this tension? Well, it begins to give us the answer, and then he spells it out further in 9 through 11 here. He says that not everybody who is an Israelite will be a recipient of the promises, that some will be saved and others won't be. And now that opens up another question for us. What's the basis upon which God decides who is going to be the real Israel and which Israelites are going to die and be eternally separated from Christ? And he gives us this answer in verse 11. If you look over in verse 11 for me, it says, "Though they were not yet born," Jacob and Esau, "and had done nothing, either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of His call." Okay, now we're seeing where Paul's going with this. He's answering the question how God's promises can be fulfilled to Israel. The way it's fulfilled is that not all of Israel is going to be saved, only some. What's the basis upon which God decides who is saved and who's not? Verse 11 tells us, election. God decides, He chooses some to be saved and others will not be saved. That's what he says in verse 11.
In my opinion, to read unconditional election into this text is an unwarranted leap, based not upon the flow of Paul's thought in this chapter, nor upon the context of Romans 9, but usually on a prior commitment to Augustinian and Calvinistic presuppositions brought into the text. You see, at the heart of the matter, Paul was identifying and addressing the Jews' fundamental misunderstanding of the Abrahamic promises. The entire physical seed of Abraham was never promised the inheritance in the first place. There is a spiritual Israel within the larger body of ethnic Israel. And since Paul knows the Jewish mind, he knows the Jew is likely to think, Paul, by claiming there are two Israels, and only one will receive the everlasting land inheritance promised to Abraham and his seed, are you implying that we have misunderstood the true import of the Abrahamic promises? And Paul will be like, that is exactly what I'm saying. But the Jew is likely to retort back that God would make distinctions within us, his chosen people, is scandalous. It seems unfair. How could he do that given what he promised us as a nation? How could there be a division within us, God's chosen people? How can he use us like that and bless us like that and not also save us? Again, the misunderstanding was that the entire physical seed of Abraham was an heir to the promises. This was wrong. Only those with the faith of Abraham were an heir to the promises. The verses that follow, verses 7 through 13 of Romans 9, essentially back and undergird God's sovereign right to make distinctions, even unconditional distinctions. As a matter of fact, Paul indicates, he did this very thing, made distinctions from the beginning, from within Abraham's family. Isaac was chosen, and not Ishmael. Jacob was chosen, and not Esau. Now this was in bringing forth ethnic Israel. The thought is, God has made distinctions from within the covenant line of Israel from the very beginning. But note that these distinctions have nothing to do with eternal destinies of individuals, nor of unconditional election. No, they have to do with which individuals would herald the promises originally given to Abraham, who would comprise ethnic Israel. And given what God had done in the past in making those distinctions, it's not wrong for him to now make distinctions in the first century within Israel on the basis of unconditional election? No. On the basis of faith in the Messiah, as the entirety of the book of Romans makes abundantly clear.